Hello everyone, this is Ozic. Welcome to the Practical Grammar Tenses course. The tense series consists of a total of 12 parts plus additional videos, and this is part 4. Since all the class guidelines were already explained in the introduction video, I'll skip them here. Still, let me remind you once again. Always approach vocabulary through full sentences, not isolated word lists. And don't just pay attention to pronunciation. Keep stress and intonation in mind as well. Also, please remember that all course materials are the result of many years of study and research, so if you want to use them elsewhere, you must contact us in advance and clearly cite the source. The class booklet has a total of 54 pages, including exercises. You can download it after signing up on our website. I recommend printing it out before class, but if that's difficult, you can split your screen while watching. Of course, you can still follow the lecture without downloading anything. When we study grammar, our main goal is just one: communicating effectively. Let's get the ball rolling. Today we're going to talk about the past tense. Compared to the present tense, the past tense has a smaller range of use. Before explaining that, let's first look at how to form past and past participle forms. This is often tested in vocabulary questions and is also very important for understanding meaning in reading comprehension. Let's start with regular verbs. Regular verbs form the past tense by adding the morpheme ed to the base verb. In this case, generally, the past and past participle forms are the same. These regular verbs emerged during the Middle English period after the Norman conquest of England, as languages came into contact and simplified over time. However, even among regular verbs, there are slight variations. First, when a verb ends with the letter E, you simply add D to make the past form. As shown in the table, there are many examples. You don't need to memorize all the meanings right now. You'll learn them naturally through examples later. If a verb ends with a consonant plus Y, change the Y to I, then add ed to make the past or past participle form. Also, when a verb ends with a short vowel plus a single consonant, especially when the stress falls on the last syllable, you double the final consonant before adding ed. That's how important stress position is. So if you see two consecutive consonants before ed, that means the stress is on the syllable right before ed. Finally, when a verb ends with ic, add a k before ed. There aren't many verbs like that, but they're important, so make sure to review carefully. Next, irregular verbs. Irregular verbs are those that don't follow the regular ed pattern when forming the past or past participle forms. Most of them existed long before regular verbs, dating back to Old English. The fact that we still use them today after thousands of years shows just how frequently they are used. Irregular verbs account for only about 3% of all verbs, but because of their strong tendency to preserve tradition, they have changed very little throughout history and still retain irregular forms today. However, they do follow certain patterns. First, the AAA type refers to verbs whose base, past, and past participle forms are all the same. Second, the ABB type refers to verbs that do not take ed, but whose past and past participle forms are identical. Next comes the ABC type, which is considered the most irregular group, verbs whose base, past, and past participle forms are all different. The most well-known example, of course, is the verb be. Although rare, there is also the ABA type, in which the base and past participle forms are the same, but the past form is different. Except for welcome, verbs ending in come are the most typical examples. You don't need to memorize all these irregular changes. If you read and write a lot, you'll naturally get used to them over time. You already know that rote memorization is a waste of time. However, there are several verbs that require special attention. First, the distinction between find and found. As a base verb, find means to discover, but as found, the base form means to establish or to set up, such as found a company. It's a regular verb, not the past of find. A similar case is wind and wound. Wind, spelled the same as the noun meaning air movement, is pronounced differently when used as a verb. It means to twist. When wind is used as a regular verb, it can mean to become out of breath, but that meaning is mostly spoken and not covered here. The word wound, below, is a regular verb meaning to injure, as you already know. Next, fall. Everyone knows the meaning of this irregular verb, but fell as a regular verb means to cut down trees. Now let's look at one of the most confusing and frequently tested sets of irregular verbs. At the top, lie as a regular verb means to tell a lie. The next lie, an irregular verb, means to rest or to be located. It's classified as an intransitive verb. The bottom one, lay, means to put or to place and is an irregular verb classified as transitive. If you replace the letter L with S or P, you'll understand the change even more easily. And here's the last combination. See, the top one is an irregular verb you already know. Saw, the second one, is a regular verb meaning to cut. Sew, the third verb, is a regular one meaning to stitch. Finally, sow. The irregular verb means to plant seeds. It has the same pronunciation as to sow. My elementary school English teacher once said the letter E looks like a needle and the letter O looks like a seed, and that advice has stuck with me ever since. If you think of it that way, it becomes much easier to remember. As always, we'll approach these words not by memorizing them individually, but through sentences. These sentences are designed for educational purposes. Keep in mind that in actual use, we usually don't mix these confusing verbs together like this. While exploring an old village, we discovered a hospital, and the hospital was set up in 1901. Inside, we saw a clock that someone had recently turned up to make it work, and there was also a bird with an injured wing. Let's look at the next example. The pitcher fell while winding up and got wounded, so he was in the hospital bed for a week. During that time, there were many gifts from fans, and those gifts were placed even beyond the hallway. Here, wind up refers to the pitching motion in baseball used to throw a ball with power. Let's read slowly and carefully. Please focus on verb usage.
While exploring the old village, we found a hospital that was founded in 1901, and inside, we saw a clock that someone had wound recently and a bird with a wounded wing.
The pitcher fell during his wind-up and was wounded, so he has lain in the hospital for a week, and, meanwhile, there were so many gifts sent by fans that they were laid even out in the hallway.
Next example. While cutting down a huge tree, the tree fell and the man ripped his clothes. So, he asked someone nearby, someone who happened to be spreading seeds in the ground, to needle his torn clothes back together. It's a bit repetitive and unnatural in a logical sense, but you can easily picture the situation. Next example. The woman said she was just an ordinary woman sowing seeds, but when I saw her cutting the tree she owned, I realized she had lied. Now, I don't expect you to fully understand every confusing verb just from these sentences, but the key point is to approach these words through sentences, not isolated memorization. I strongly encourage you to create your own sentences, combining these verbs appropriately. Let's read slowly and carefully. Please focus on verb usage.
Having sawed down the giant tree, which was felled in the process, the man had his clothes torn, so he asked someone nearby, who had been sowing seeds, to sow them for him.
She said she was just an ordinary woman sowing seeds, but when I saw her saw down a large tree on her own, I realized she had lied.
Now let's look at the use of the past tense. First, in the most common case, it is used to describe an event that was completed at a specific point in the past. Let's look at the examples. He broke his leg while skiing in the Alps 2 years ago, so he can't join us on the next trip. We visited the Louvre Museum while traveling in Paris last summer, and we spent almost 6 hours there. The power went out around midnight last night and wasn't restored until early this morning. In other words, the electricity didn't come back on until early this morning. This is a line from the theme song Golden by K-pop Demon Hunters, with the omitted grammatical parts restored for explanation. I was a ghost. I was alone. I couldn't even find my own place. I waited so long to break these walls and wake up to feel like myself again. You're probably familiar with it already, but let's listen.
I was a ghost. I was alone. I couldn't find my own place. I waited so long to break these walls down to wake up and feel like me.
Now, there's something important to note here. The present tense can encompass the past and the future, but the past tense cannot. To put simply, the past tense is an independent tense, completely separate from the present. For example, from the sentence, she lived in London, we know that a woman lived in London at some specific point in the past, but we have no information about whether she still lives there now. Of course, the surrounding context may clarify that, but if you only look at this one sentence, it does not tell you anything about her current situation. Please remember that firmly. Let's check pronunciation and stress. Pay particular attention to the pronunciation of Louvre, which is quite different from yours. Focus on the intonation and the use of the past tense, especially the idea that it has no connection to the present.
He broke his leg while skiing in the Alps 2 winters ago, so he couldn't join us on the next trip.
We visited the Louvre Museum during our trip to Paris last summer and spent nearly 6 hours there.
The power went out around midnight yesterday, and it didn't come back on until early this morning.
The past tense can also be used to describe habits, but unlike the present tense, it refers to habits that are no longer true in the present. It also often appears together with time markers, adverbs or phrases that indicate a period in the past. Let's look at the examples. She often walked 3 miles to school, even in the middle of winter, because there was no bus service in the village. Before smartphones became common, we used to print maps regularly before going on a trip. My father used to read the newspaper every evening after dinner, drinking black tea at the kitchen table. We always spent our summers at my aunt's cabin by the lake, where we fished, swam, and roasted marshmallows. The examples themselves aren't difficult, right? But pay close attention to the hidden meaning of the past tense combined with the red time markers. They all describe habits or repeated actions in the past, but each carries the implied meaning that those actions no longer continue in the present. That implied meaning is essential for understanding time, relationships, and logic in reading comprehension. Recognizing the hidden meanings conveyed by tense is more important than most people realize. Let's check pronunciation and stress.
She often walked 3 miles to school, even in the middle of winter, because there was no bus in her village.
Before smartphones became common, we regularly printed out maps before going on a road trip.
My father read the newspaper every evening after dinner while sipping black tea at the kitchen table.
We always spent our summers at my aunt's cabin by the lake, where we fished, swam, and roasted marshmallows.
Next, the past tense is also used when describing situations or actions that used to be true but are no longer so, that is, when expressing changed circumstances or past states of being. Again, it often works together with time markers. Once, this neighborhood grew well with small family-owned shops and weekend markets, which brought the community together. In other words, this neighborhood used to be full of life, with small family-run stores and weekend markets that united people. The hall was previously used as a concert place for performances by world-famous orchestras, and it hosted many events that attracted large audiences. In both sentences, there is an implied idea. These things are no longer true today. Let's listen and check pronunciation and stress up to this point.
Once, this neighborhood thrived with small family-owned shops and weekend markets that brought the community together.
The hall was formerly used as a concert venue for renowned orchestras from around the world, hosting performances that drew large audiences.
Now let's look at the next sentence. Once the woman held a position of great influence within the company, where she made key decisions that shaped its long-term strategy. In other words, she once occupied an important role in the company and made crucial decisions that defined its long-term direction. Long ago, the castle stood as a symbol of power and protection for the region and guarded the nearby villages from invasion. This next line is from a very famous song. Yesterday, all my troubles seemed so far away. This is a figurative expression meaning that in the past, life seemed free of problems, and from that we can infer that now there are problems. Let's listen.
Yesterday all my troubles seemed so far away.
Let's check pronunciation and stress. Focus on the implied meaning that something was true in the past but is no longer true now. This underlying contrast, something was different before but has since changed, is one of the most frequently tested logical cues in reading comprehension exams. It means some kind of change has taken place, whether in cause, pace, direction, or outcome, and that's where deeper analysis begins. Of course, we'll cover those aspects in detail when we study longer reading passages. Before that, make sure you build a solid foundation here.
At one time, she held a position of great influence within the company, making key decisions that shaped its long-term strategy.
Long ago, this castle stood as a symbol of power and protection for the region, guarding the surrounding villages from invasions.
Although it's not very common, the past tense is sometimes used in proverbs or sayings. However, if you think carefully, you'll see that even though these sentences take the form of the past tense, the universal lessons they convey actually belong to the present. Again, there's no need to memorize them. Rome wasn't built in a day. In other words, it takes a long time to achieve something great. They came, they saw, they conquered. These are the famous words of Julius Caesar of Rome, often quoted to highlight accomplishments achieved through confident leadership. The grass looked greener on the other side. This expression describes the human tendency to think that other situations always look better than one's own. But in reality, it reminds us that the other side often isn't as different as it seems, a reflection of the gap between ideal and reality. Let's read these together.
Rome wasn't built in a day.
They came, they saw, they conquered.
The grass was greener on the other side.
The past tense is also used when describing historical facts. You can understand this usage easily by looking at some examples. However, if we dig deeper, even something that seems obvious requires more careful thought. For instance, what exactly qualifies as a historical fact? And is it wrong to use the past perfect tense when describing one? Since this point appears frequently on standardized exams, it's important to know it precisely, although few sources explain it clearly. We will go into greater detail about this in the lesson on sequence of tenses. The past tense itself isn't very complicated, right? Now, for its last major use. The past tense is also used when we describe or narrate episodes or events in the past, or when we list a series of past actions. This isn't a difficult concept either. Let's see a longer example. Except for a few words, the content isn't very hard, so I'll paraphrase. Last spring, I traveled to Florence with a grand plan and a perfectly color-coded travel plan. On the third day, I accidentally got off the train 3 stops early, thinking I had arrived at the famous garden. There were no signs, taxis, or English speakers, only vineyards and sheep. At first, I was frustrated and hungry, wishing I had double-checked the map. But soon, I remembered that I had packed a small lunch. So, I sat under an olive tree, calmed myself, and had a picnic. As I ate, the quiet and the fresh breeze began to feel better than any famous tourist site. A nearby farmer waved to me and held out a basket of fresh figs. We exchanged clumsy Italian words and smiles, and he kindly walked with me to the nearest bus stop an hour later. When I got back to the city, I had missed 2 museum visits, but I didn't mind at all. That unexpected picnic became the most peaceful moment of the entire trip. Let's read this together, paying close attention to pronunciation and stress.
Last spring, I traveled to Florence with big plans and a perfectly color-coded itinerary. On the third day, I accidentally got off the train 3 stops too early, thinking I had arrived at the famous gardens. There was no signal, no taxis, and no English-speaking locals, just vineyards and sheep. At first, I was annoyed and hungry, regretting not double-checking the map. But then I remembered I had packed a small lunch, so I picnicked under an olive tree, trying to calm down. As I ate, the silence and fresh breeze started to feel better than any tourist attraction. A farmer nearby waved at me and offered fresh figs from his basket. We shared broken Italian and smiles, and he even walked me to the nearest bus stop an hour later. By the time I got back to the city, I had missed 2 museums but didn't mind at all. That unexpected picnic turned out to be the most peaceful moment of the entire trip.
Now, let's go over the important part. The 3 pink-colored sections. These are often called had plus past participle, but their grammatical roles differ. The final one is known as the past perfect, which we'll study later in detail. However, the first 2 sections represent what is traditionally called the pluperfect. In this example, the action of mistaking the station happened before getting off the train, and the action of packing the lunch occurred before remembering it. Therefore, we use the pluperfect to make the time sequence clear. In English, we call it the pluperfect. It's not exactly an additional tense of its own, but rather a way to express an action or state completed earlier than a specific point in the past. In other words, it's used to show that one past event happened before another past event more explicitly. However, here's something important to note. Its form is the same as that of the past perfect. Many grammar books use pluperfect and past perfect interchangeably, but in this course, we'll distinguish them strictly because their functions differ. In short, the past perfect implies an influence extending into the past, whereas the pluperfect simply marks an earlier event without affecting another past situation. It's similar to how the past tense stands independently of the present. You can see the difference clearly when you visualize it on the time continuum. Also, the term pluperfect doesn't necessarily refer to a distant past. Even an event that happened just 1 second before another can take the pluperfect form, just as the past tense can describe something that happened a second ago. That's why it's considered a compound tense rather than a simple one. But again, you don't need to worry about the terminology. Now let's map out the time sequence from the earlier example on the time continuum. Recalling the act of packing the lunch belongs to the past, but packing the lunch itself happened earlier than that moment. She realized that she had left her umbrella behind only after it started raining heavily outside the library. The act of leaving the umbrella happened before realizing it. Dr. Kim answered all the questions and problems that the committee members had raised during the previous meeting. The concerns were raised before they were addressed. After the conference ended, the participants gathered in the lobby to discuss the new policy. The meeting had ended before they gathered. However, because the conjunction after already clarifies the time order, the simple past is also acceptable here without using the pluperfect. Before the sun set behind the mountains, the hikers barely reached the campsite and set up their tents. The sun set before their arrival. However, since the conjunction before already makes the order clear, again, the simple past works fine without the pluperfect. The time relationship between the pluperfect and the past tense is very important. Let's check pronunciation and stress. As we read together this time, please focus on identifying the time sequence of past events expressed through the pluperfect.
I remembered I had packed a small lunch, so I picnicked under an olive tree.
She realized she had forgotten her umbrella only after the heavy rain began pouring down outside the library.
Dr. Kim addressed all the concerns that had been raised by the committee members during the earlier sessions.
The participants gathered in the lobby to discuss the new policies after the conference ended.
Before the sun set behind the mountains, the hikers managed to reach the campsite and set up their tents.
Today, we practice not only the past tense grammar, but also the vocabulary and direct reading skills needed to understand real English sentences. As you continue building this process step by step, you'll find that English sentences will start to truly come into focus for you. The past tense is especially powerful in conditionals and in the sequence of tenses. You'll see how important the past tense is when we study conditionals and the sequence of tenses in the next lesson. That's why review is extremely important. You should review not only grammar but also vocabulary and sentence structure at the same time. You did a wonderful job today, and I look forward to seeing your continued growth in our next lesson. Thank you very much.